Hi, welcome to Unmuted, where I have candid connectivity conversations with industry experts. This week, I'm joined by Henry Calvert from the GSMA to talk about all things network as a service, from what excites him personally about the shift to how APIs, vertical use cases, and enterprise adoption are shaping the future of programmable networking. Hi, Henry.
Hi, how you doing, Catherine?
I am good. How are you?
Brilliant, brilliant.
Excellent. So you've been following the evolution of network as a service closely. On a personal level, what excites you most about how it's reshaping the relationship between telco and enterprises?
Yeah, it's certainly reshaping the relationship because we've desperately needed that ability to be able to simply connect enterprises and allow them to be able to connect to the capabilities that in mobile networks, the generational changes have brought to bear over the last couple of years. In fact, the standards that the mobile technology is built on has had a fundamental change between 4G and 5G. They've gone towards service-based architecture. And with the growth of cloud-native enterprise workloads, it's almost been, there's two fundamentals there, store and compute. And we've seen the hyperscalers be able to actually provide programmable access to store and compute. And I see NaaS actually now getting to that ability of being able to provide programmable connectivity, which has got to be one of the other fundamental accesses for an enterprise. They want reliable storage, they want the best compute, and they want to be able to have the best and most reliable connectivity so their virtualized services can perform best to their customers.
I mean, and this is already a $16.5 billion market, right? So, and Europe's in the lead. I've heard you say that. So, what do you see as the biggest drivers of growth, and where are the untapped opportunities globally?
I think if we look at it from a geographical basis, I mean, there's lots of forecasts out there and they can reach to around about 250, 270 billion for NAS. But what we're seeing, the fundamental, what's fueling that forecast is the fact that, if you look at China and China Telecom, they've done a small pilot with 18 million customers and doing 570 million API calls just through an API service called Quality on Demand, which is to get a better downlink and a better uplink from the mobile telephone networks. But we're also seeing the way that nations, the Asia Pacific, have got rapid digitization programs across China and India to ensure that smart cities are actually going to be able to start to fuel the demand for these types of capabilities. We're seeing, obviously, I'm going to mention AI at some point, and we're seeing the workloads for AI. At the moment, they're very contained within the data centers. But at some point, the richness of information is going to be required, ultimately is going to come from devices. And those devices are either smartphones, or they might be IoT devices, or they might be new type of headsets and glasses that we are seeing emerging out into the marketplaces that are looking for less of an interaction and more of a conversation in how they're actually deploying it. So that's going to actually, fuel the ability of actually saying we need programmable networks and we need a NaaS to actually sit behind it. And I think underneath all this is sort of the productivity sort of gains that SME enterprises, small, medium enterprises are going to actually start to unlock themselves. At the moment, we will always see with new technologies fairly high price marks. And as that commoditizes down into sort of the larger scale SME environment, then we'll start to see them start to make productivity gains and start to adopt NaaS as one of those core network technologies along with their cloud and storage, cloud native platforms that they have.
Okay, and how do you define programmable networking today? What makes NaaS fundamentally different from traditional managed network services?
I think I mentioned it a little bit earlier. We've had a shift within the 5G standardization of mobile telephone networks. Before 4G and previously, it was there were boxes that were appliances. They did a function and a role. And they didn't expose their interfaces very well. And sometimes they did, but it ended up to be highly proprietary in there. Bringing 5G to the front has actually brought a service-based architecture that it's looking for cloud-native infrastructure to be deployed on. So we've now got software functions. So it's now relatively easy to actually say, okay, how do I build interfaces for that? And how do I make them programmable? And that's where we get the word API from, isn't it? Application Programmable Interface is just an exposure and the way it has been done before. So this services a surface-centric architecture has enabled, the as service of what telecommunications connectivity can actually provide. We've tried this before. Now, I think the difference here now is that the enterprises are basically saying, there are too many networks out there providing me proprietary-based interfaces. I need to have a common interface and a common way of doing it. And I'll be honest, it's taken the telecommunications companies a little bit of time to actually get up with, sort of software repositories like GitHub. We've been a little bit shy at opening up to the open source world. And now that has started through initiatives from the Linux Foundation, of course, like Kamara. GSMA also, we have our own GitHub repositories now where we're sharing code and frameworks that enterprises can use themselves because, they tend to want to have that access. They want to have a try before they buy type environment. And that's how the cloud native hyperscalers have actually grown their services and businesses. So it's just the right time now where this next generation of technology has started to actually make the transition to a cloud native based infrastructure. All the functions are in software. Those functions can be exposed through SCEF and NEF standard activities. And we're just trying to actually advocate what that's actually happening in more of an open source environment, along with the Linux Foundation and Kamara.
Excellent. And let's talk a little bit about what operators are actually launching APIs for. I've definitely heard some examples of 5G slicing, edge compute, that sort of thing. But what do you kind of foresee as becoming the anchor APIs that enterprises will actually adopt at scale?
Yeah. Well, if I talk about the anchor today is very much around authentication and anti-fraud. And it's probably what we hear around society at this point in time. Authentication's always been there, and we've sort of had second factor authentication over SMS or OTP, one-time passwords. And there's been challenges to that with authentication apps, etc. But when we look at an API like number verification, the mobile phone is now so personal. If we can get that number verification to be under a silent API framework, then the migration of traffic from one-time passwords, SMSs effectively, can now be done pretty much silently for the customer as they're either using their app or they're browsing a certain site on their website. So authentication is sort of a migration. It's been migrating for a couple of years now over towards APIs and what it's doing. And we've just been able to standardize that and accelerate that. Since the pandemics, it seems to have come to bear that, unfortunately, the amount of scams and sort of fraud has increased significantly. And everyone is now aware of it and concerned about it. So there's sort of been an effect where there's been significant growth around the use of SIM swap, device location, number verification, three core based APIs that, we've seen doubling, nearly tripling of growth of usage of those APIs, particularly by the banks also saying, if I could just get the same of these APIs on the same from each of the networks in the markets, and that's right. And that's what we've been doing in GSMA, market by market. We've been making sure the same API is available for the banks to use and they've been consuming it. We've also sort of gone a little bit more in depth in connectivity insights, and we've created an API called Scam Signal, which sort of identifies if someone's in a scam call that's going for authorized push payments. And we've seen real impact around about 30% reduction or 30% improvement in actually identifying where a scam call is going on. But you started the question exactly where we think we're going to anchor, because anti-fraud and authentication, they are maturing value pools and revenue streams. And there's some migration, as I've mentioned. When you think about communications quality, which is a set of insights, like connectivity insights, quality on demand, population density, APIs, KYC match, KYC fill in. KYC is know your customer. Of course, I think everyone is starting to actually understand that. But they're fundamentally going to start to bring new revenue streams. And as we start to add on quality on demand with edge site discovery and edge site selection, we're going to see more value starting to actually come in. People are going to actually understand where they can put their workloads, whether that be from an agentic AI point of view or whether that be through a gamer's point of view. They're going to understand where's the best place to put their workloads and the applications across the network. I think there's a huge amount of value in that going to come forward.
So I know that the GSMA is very serious about the API opportunity for operators, but how realistic is API monetization for telcos when you compare it to hyperscalers and SaaS providers who already dominate the developer ecosystem?
And they do. They dominate the developers, and they have done, and they have a right to, be there in that part of the value chain. In fact, they've created this value chain. I think, as I mentioned before, they're providing store and compute and programmable store and compute. And connectivity is going to be so important. And people are now understanding, as they're moving their workloads to a cloud-based infrastructure, connectivity and understanding that connectivity and how you can manipulate that connectivity to your best advantage is becoming significantly important. So I don't think I'm saying that, the operators are going to be able to build this relationship with the enterprise developers. There will be a value chain in there. And it's not just going to be connectivity and NaaS-based APIs that is going to make a solution. If we take financial institutions on doing credit scoring, there are many different attributes that are being pulled together, especially in large data sets. And then the analysis of those data sets to understand whether someone, either has a potential loss because of fraud or getting a credit score to say, actually, this person is valuable enough to be able to provide a loan or even insurance across that. We're bringing more vectors in that's bringing a better fingerprint about what a consumer or a customer can actually provide to that. So I'm not really trying to say, I think the opportunity for operators is, yes, there's value that they can make out of connectivity. But they've also got a decision on whether they want to move up the value chain as well. At the moment, the edge, I think, is, hyper regional, okay, and is coming into cities, as the data warehousing is fundamentally moving. Are the hyperscalers going to be, very focused on building these data centers, or will they partner with telecommunications companies to create new edges, which are much more hyper-localized in where they actually need to get to? And then how do you make that interoperable? How do you make the communications and distributing the workloads to the right place very quickly? So there's a lot more of a partnership activities going on than we might think. Then, we hear about the competition, but I think there is more partnerships out there than we actually give credit for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that kind of explanation or clarification about the relationship here. For my last question, I want to kind of ask maybe some of the barriers for enterprise adoption, right? So large enterprises hold 64% of NaaS share. And I think you kind of talked a little bit about how SMBs are approaching this, but many still see it as experimental. So what are the barriers keeping CIOs from integrating NaaS into core IT operations?
Yeah, I think there are a number of factors. I think going back to basic principles, I think the first one is knowledge. Knowledge that these capabilities exist. And these capabilities are starting to become simple and flexible enough for CIOs to get involved and invest in that. And it's a very good point, and it's a very important point. I could talk about standardization, organizational inertia, and the ROI of everything. I just think we have to build confidence and trust with CIOs that they can actually get the reach they need, that is simple for them to use. And operators have a very clear way of doing the commercial attributes to it, whether it's terms and conditions, whether it's pricing, etc. We have to build that trust with CIOs and enterprises. But first, they need to know about it. And we've done a lot of work from what I call an inside out. And one sort of thing I'm bold at saying around telecommunications is they kind of have they been good at, building services for enterprise? It's very much an inside out approach, or I will build it and they will come. And in the GSMA, we started off a small team that's looking at it from an outside in approach. So I'm getting enterprises to say, this is what I need, this is where I need it, and this is when I need it. So they can give clear signals to the operators. And then the bit in the middle we've got to get right is that it's just clear and simple for the enterprises to then work with the operators or channel partners. Channel partners are significantly important here. Operators are not going to be focused enough to do this all on their own. And you've got lovely channel partners already out there. You've got Vonage, you've got Secure ID, you've got Infobip. There's a whole list of 50 channel partners that we've been working with to help the enterprises and communicate with the enterprises about how this is done when they're making the statement about what they want and where they want it. And lastly, to say, we're seeing the emergence of Bridge Alliance API Exchange. We've also seen the emergence of Aduna, which is looking from a wholesale point of view. How do I wholesale that? So I even make it more simple that there's only one entry point to actually get access to API and API reach in effectively what is nearly 750 different operators out there. I think we've got 285 underneath our MOU at the moment, which reaches just nearly 80% of mobile connections. Obviously, as you get the bigger operators, you get that. But I won't be, stopping at 285 networks, and we need to get to 500, 600, 700, then the opportunities right across the long tail. But yeah, making it really simple for the enterprises and let the enterprises have a voice to actually say what they need and where they need it.
I think that's a perfect place to end, right? I think that's a good takeaway. So, Henry, thank you so much for this conversation.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for all tuning in. I'll see you next week.